This is a serious thing that every company must do. But how does the visible JPMorgan set up a hit by the truck and then onto that succession plan?
Yeah, over at Berkshire Hathaway, they call this the man in the envelope strategy, or the person in the envelope strategy. Who takes over if Jamie Dimon is not there at JPMorgan? He talks about it in the shareholder letter. He says at every board meeting, with or without the CEO, who's also the chairman, they talk about succession planning. And remember, he has now one very clear number two, who's Daniel Pinto, but he also has two women who have been rising into different roles, now leading community banking, more than 66 million people, households served around the world over at JPMorgan that these two women are responsible for.
And then they leave. You are encyclopedic on whether Marianne Lake or Jennifer Piszak leave, but they leave JPMorgan because he's going to be there forever. With this annual letter, what's the measurement of forever for Mr. Dimon?
That's a great question, because he's getting on to 2 decades of leading JPMorgan.
He mentioned it early, 2000, Bank One. Yeah.
How many times do people say, is JPMorgan bigger or too big without Jamie Dimon here? Is this another Citigroup situation in Sandy Weill, who of course Jamie Dimon was his protege as well? So I think that's the big question here. Are these two women ready to take over? How soon would they take over? What else do they need to take over? You have Jennifer Piszak here, who had ran investment banking, different investment banking operations, had different parts of the bank under her wing. You have Marianne Lake, who was a CFO, very front-facing. They talk about the relationship with asset managers and investors, not only those individual investors who now will have more power when it comes to proxy voting as well, but also those large investors that they deal with at the asset manager that is only becoming a more important part of the bank.
Sonali, when we talk about cult of personality and Jamie Dimon is really at the helm of it, how much is the message that he was sending to Washington, D.C., sort of how much does that take on a new precedence or sort of a new prominence in the discussion about how to handle some of the bank failures we've seen of late?
He has a very nuanced take in this letter, isn't it, Lisa? Because he talks about how JPMorgan banks 350 of more than 4,000 of America's own banks. But remember, for JPMorgan, they also talk about all the challenges it is to be a bank. We talk about the recent move in money market funds, Lisa, but he mentions that $650 billion have moved since April 2022 into money market funds. Meanwhile, deposits at large banks are down by $1 trillion. And so you think about this wholesale shift in the banking system and what it means for America's banks and the ability to both bring in deposits as well as lend money out to communities. There is a real conundrum here that has been brewing for structural reasons in the market. And now he's also saying that he's not saying don't regulate the banks. He's just saying think about what mix of regulations will make this banking system healthier. And I think that is the debate that is being had as we watch the failure of Silicon Valley Bank.
There also is a lot of finger pointing. Let's be very clear. He talks about how they missed some issues that were hiding in plain sight, that when they regulate, they create problems, including having a lot of these banks hold huge portfolios of treasuries and then having to figure out what to do with potential mark-to-market losses as rates rise. What is his influence in Washington, D.C. right now at a time when perhaps banks aren't as much persona non grata in Washington, D.C., but certainly aren't welcomed with open arms?
Yeah, how fascinating is it? Because you think about the last few years where we had a return to that annual bringing CEOs down to Congress again. That has not been a practice over the last decade, but in the last couple of years, it's been an annual meeting, if you will, and those banks have been grilled, particularly about their presence in these communities, particularly when it comes to mortgages. And by the way, that is something that Dimon is telling you in this letter, that it's become an unattractive business in so many ways, particularly because Wall Street has left the business behind.
And I read the letter, every word of it. I sit down and full disclosure, Sonali, with a beverage of my choice in my hand. Is he running for Secretary of Treasury? I mean, I look at the back third. There's a Wall Street Journal op-ed reprint. He's talking about policy, democracy, I should say. Is this guy running for Secretary of Treasury?
That's been the forever parlor game. Is it Jamie Dimon?
Well, I'm doing it right now. I mean, here we are with a letter. Are we going to be talking about Secretary Dimon?
I think it's interesting when our own Ed Hammond asked him the question whether he'd consider a government post. He shunned the idea at that time. That was only a couple of months ago at this time. He has said he's wanted to stay at the helm of JPMorgan, but I think every year that goes by...
I mean, Secretary Mellon, a million years ago, and I'm not making a Mellon-Dimon equivalency here, but how do you say no to that job?
You can ask the same of Brian Moynihan as well. I mean, I think the question about whether these bankers have a future in government as a Treasury Secretary in a future administration in particular is a big question, and will the populace allow for it? I think Lisa's question here about, the love-hate with the bankers is an interesting one, because there's a lot of criticism now from Wall Street when you look at the Biden administration about whether some of the regulators have the intimacy when it comes to the financial industry to regulate, and not just by the letter of the law, but by means of supervision appropriately.
First question of the earnings season. I'll give it to you, Sonali Basak. Are we going to see a lot of layoffs?
I think you're also going to see people bring on people that have been left behind in the layoffs we're already seeing. But yeah, I think you will. Remember, something interesting next week, Tom, is you have First Republic anticipated to come before JPMorgan. Usually JPMorgan leads off the wave, but you have to wonder what happens next Thursday when we get all those answers about First Republic that nobody today knows.